I don't know if you've ever gone through the Sermon on the Mount and just sort of tried to divide it up in sections or anything like that. Sometimes it's helpful to outline, and I guess that's sort of an outline. I looked through it, and it sort of lended itself, I thought, to 12 different sections, and it ends up pretty much as it starts off. What's it start off with? The Beatitudes. And what do the Beatitudes say? What's almost every one of them say? They repeat something. Blessed are, and then it gives some kind of a godly attribute or a godly practice. So if you live after this godly fashion, you'll be blessed. How does the Sermon on the Mount end? What's the last thing Jesus says? It said if you apply these words, if you keep these words, that's in chapter 7. Everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. What happens if your house is built on the rock? The floods come, the rains come, the storms come, and your house stands firm. What if you build your house on the sand? It gets washed away. Great will be, yes. So he starts out saying, blessed are you if you live this way after a godly fashion. And then he closes it up saying, blessed are you if you follow these teachings that teach you to live after a godly fashion. So right there, sandwiched in between are 10 other sections, as I would count them. You might break it up a little differently. But here's sort of what I would call each one of those sections. Salt, light, city on a hill. What's the message there? Your life is supposed to have a positive impact in the world. That's the message that I see there. We can talk about all the particulars of salt and light and a city on a hill. When I was a kid, I never really got that city on a hill thing until I put it in the perspective of a first century traveler. You're traveling. What are you looking for today if you're traveling? Place to get some gas, place to get a hamburger, and now we got these cool, I thought the GPS thing when it first came out was really cool, not because it would tell you which road to take, because you could look up restaurants. And you could figure out, oh, we're going to eat a Cracker Barrel there, and then we're going to eat at Shoney's up there. Oh, they've got a BJ's. Well, okay, whatever it is. Well, in the first century, you didn't have the neat road signs, and you didn't have highway police, and you didn't have everybody to take care of you if you had any kind of a problem. So when you looked up ahead and you saw a city up on a hill, you know, there's a place to go. We'll get something to eat there. We'll have security. It's going to be a walled city almost. We can go inside and not worry about being accosted by robbers out here on the road. So that's the idea of a city on a hill. And of course, light and salt, those are obviously beneficial as we understand them just in our lives. Think about what they must have been like in the first century. How much do we take light for granted today? Flip a switch, you got light. What was it like in the first century? Even if you had good light, you didn't have good light. Salt. We think of salt just something to put on your food, make it taste a little different. In the first century, you depended on salt so you could have meat longer than just 1 or 2 days. It's a very different way to look at it when you put it in the historic perspective. But that's the idea. And then the next part is where Jesus said, your righteousness has to exceed the righteousness of whom? Pharisees and Sadducees. And unless your righteousness exceeds their righteousness, you're not coming into the kingdom. And then he gives us a whole list of ways in which the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees was not very good. And that's in chapter 5 where he does this. You've heard that it was said, you've heard that the ancients were told, and then he talks about all these ways in which their righteousness only went so far. And it was a very legalistic approach to righteousness. You can call anybody anything you want, as long as you don't murder them, because that's what the law said, you can't murder. So you can call them anything in the book, as long as you don't kill them, just don't kill them. And what did Jesus say about that? What's that? Yeah. Everyone, verse 22, who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. Whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. Whoever says, you fool, will be guilty enough to go into a fiery hell. I'm careful about calling people fools. There's a big temptation for that because there's just a lot of silliness in the world, especially today, it seems like. And we know about it. Used to be people did stupid stuff and you didn't hear about it. Now you hear about everything because it's on the news. And Jesus is saying, get a hold of your heart. Get a hold of the way you think about people, because, and he doesn't go on to elaborate about all this, but this is going to be the last one he talks about too. Here he's talking about murder. The last one he's going to talk about is, you've heard that it's said you can love your neighbor and hate your enemy. What's Jesus say about that? You want to be like God, you got to love your enemies too. If you want to be perfect as God is perfect, and I know I've talked about this before, but perfect in the Greek, the teleos perfect, was not like we think of perfect in our social vernacular. For us, perfect is totally without flaw. What did it mean? What was teleos perfect? Complete, whole. And the illustration, the hand is a handy thing to use as an illustration. If you've got all 4 fingers in your thumb, you've got a teleos, a perfect hand. It doesn't matter if it's got a manicure or if one of your fingers is goofy long or crooked or whatever. If you got all those fingers, it's a... I saw a picture of somebody who was pointing at something and his finger went about 3 different directions. It wasn't broken, or it was a regular finger, but it just kind of had the crooks in it. And my fingers are all just stubby straight. Anyway, that's a teleos hand. If you want to be a teleos human being, you got to love your enemies too. Why? Because that's what God does. That's what God does. And that's the whole intent of each one of these teachings. You've heard that it was said, and this is the way the Pharisees and Sadducees do it, and your righteousness has got to exceed that. But I'm telling you, this is the way God thinks about it. And that's the way to do it. This isn't about feelings, and that's a wonderful, I'm glad you asked that question, because you cannot control your feelings, but you can control your behavior. And that's what this is all about, controlling your behavior. So how can you love your enemy even if you feel like, ah? Yes. Yes. Pray to God for them. Lord, you know how I feel about this guy, but I'm asking you to bless him. You know, I have trouble in my heart when I think about him. I got dark places there, but I know he's made in your image and you want the best for him. And so I want the best for him because you want the best for him. If he needs something, what can you do? You can supply that need. If your enemy's hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him a drink. If his car's broke down, recommend a good mechanic. Go see if you can help fix it. Give him a tow. Help him push it out of the way.
It's hard to hate somebody that you're praying.
Yes, it is. They don't go together. And so you can start out with bad feelings and work your way, and I don't mean, work is a bad word for some reason, but really, you can work at this. You can work at loving people. And are there not some people you have to work at loving? But listen, if Jesus can hang on the cross and ask God to forgive the guys that put him there, what do I have as an excuse? I'm so glad that he did that for us. Of the 7 things he said on the cross, the one we remember the most, probably, Father, forgive them. Father, forgive them. And so when I think about, Jesus did that. Yeah, okay. Well, I'm going to follow him. I better do that too. All of these teachings, divorce. Why would a Jewish man divorce his wife if he was a usual, normal Jewish man in the first century? He found some uncleanness in her. That's what Deuteronomy says. If you find some uncleanness, what could be that uncleanness? She burnt the toast. It's unclean toast. Whatever, because you could say whatever you wanted to make an uncleanness, and Jesus comes along and says, no, that's not the way it goes. Bob.
I talked to you about this earlier, and I forgot to apologize. I don't think this is a comprehensive list. That's what he said there. I think these are helping us to adjust our mindset to his commands. You know, because I think just about anything that is told us, we need to look at it with these lenses on and go, yeah, I mean, this is what's said. He expects more of me than this.
Right. And we understand that as parents. If you think about raising your children, Is it necessary to tell your child each and everything they cannot do? Or do you expect them, based on what you've already taught them they can't do, to know better? And don't we use that phrase as parents? You know better. You know better than that. Well, you didn't tell me this specifically. Yeah, but you know better. And what's the know better based on? Past experience. What else? The principles. It's all the principles. And we understand that. Kids know that. I knew that when I was a kid. You try to get legal about, well, Mommy, that's right, all right. Marty Kessler, Marty Joe. That's what it would always be. Marty Joe, you know. And I knew it was going to come to that, but I always thought, I might get out of this. And I knew in the back of my mind, I'm not going to get out of this. But that's what we do. But it's all about understanding, as we used to say when I was growing up, which way's the grass blowing? That's... Because when you see the grass bow down, what's that tell you? It tells you the direction of the wind. And when you see what Jesus is saying is important to God, you know that's the way the wind's blowing. So if you had a choice between two behaviors and one you kind of, I don't know, but the other one, well, that's not what I want to do, but that's what I should do. And how many times are we really in a clutch to figure out what's right? Most of the time we know.
I've never understood why adultery is the only reason you can divorce your spouse and get remarried. Because if you have a husband that beats you or abuses your kids, to me that's a perfectly good reason to get divorced.
Right. The thing that Jesus seems to be bearing down here on is because I don't know how much of that was going on in the first century, but the problem historically was that Jewish men, well, go back to Deuteronomy 24. This goes all the way back to 1500 BC or thereabouts when the law was given. When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he's found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her from his house. She leaves his house and goes out and becomes another man's wife. And if the latter husband turns against her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her to be his wife, then the former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her again to be his wife, since she has been defiled. That's an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land which your Lord your God gives you as an inheritance. And when a man takes a wife, verse 5, he shall not go out with the army or be charged with any duty. He shall be free at home 1 year and shall give happiness to his wife whom he has taken. Starting with verse 5, what's the whole point of that first year?
Know each other, fight for each other, love each other.
Okay. And whatever I'm sorry? Bonding, yes. Whatever we make of that, is there not a value put on marriage based on what it says in verse 5? You get married that first year, that's to be your focus. Not the military, not any public service. You make your marriage your focus for that first year. After the first year, it's no big deal. Right. You think that's the message? No, if that's the message for the first year, this is God saying, I want to put it in your minds to make your marriage a priority. Now, previously, it says in verses 1 through 4, if the husband finds some, indecency in her, what can he do? He can write her a certificate of divorce. Now, who does that protect? It protects her. If he's going to be a jerk, she has to have something to fall back on. And what she can fall back on is a legitimate certificate of divorce. Now, what did Jesus say about this in Matthew 19? I know we're not in Matthew 19. You've never read Matthew 19, have you? What do you say, bud?
We're forgetting that most of the women did not get to choose who they were married. Their fathers. And that was protection, I believe, for the woman. In other words, it's a coming together. And sometimes, what was it, Abraham sent his servant to get a
Right?
for his son. That's even more than the father, but I think that certificate of divorce was primarily to protect the woman,
Right.
because she didn't get any choice.
Right. So now she's got a legitimate reason to be separated from her first husband and married to another, so she's not out on the street by herself. But your question was about what if there's an abusive situation for the wife? Jesus doesn't directly address that. What he continually addresses is the sanctity of the marriage bond. It's interesting what is said about it, but also how things play out in history. For example, how many wives did David have when he married Bathsheba? And when I say married, keep going. You just remember 4. Well, that's probably what got him in trouble. He only probably remembered 4 too, but he had 7. he had 7. Let me see here. What? Well, now you're probably thinking about Solomon. Solomon had some concubines. I don't think David had any concubines. Let's see here. Back up. I'm in 2 Samuel, by the way. Yes.
With Solomon's 700 wives, he had it made. He never had to join the military.
Oh, man. Maybe that was his deal. He just get married every year.
Also, I still have a cousin who was married under the Reverend Moon, some young Moon or something like that. He says, you and you get together, be married. And they have a service, in their church. And they've been married ever since. And they were strangers to each other.
That's an interesting thing about marriage in the Bible. There is no set liturgy for a marriage ceremony or service. It seems that God left that up to the different cultures. Marriage, there's no question about marriage. One man, one woman, that's the way it's supposed to be from the beginning. They got away from that in various ways, but it was always men and women getting married. But there was never a set way in the scriptures that had to be, this is how you get married to a woman. They just, as a matter of fact, how did Jacob get married? He spent the night with the one he thought was his bride. Who did he wake up with? Her sister. Can you imagine? Anyway, bless Leah's heart. But that was just the way they did it then. Now, 2 Samuel chapter 3. Sons were born to David at Hebron. His firstborn was Amnon by Ahinoam the Jezreelitess. His second, Chileab by Abigail, the widow of Nabal the Carmelite. The third, Absalom, the son of Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. The fourth, Adonijah, the son of Haggith. And the fifth, Shephatiah, the son of Abital. The sixth, Ithream by David's wife Eglah. These were born to David at Hebron. How many is that? That's 6? Wait a minute. Was there another one? Yeah. Now why is she not mentioned here?
Because she never bore a child.
Yeah, they had a fight, and he said, I'm not having any children with you. And so, but there were seven wives. And then there's this whole mess with Bathsheba. And when I say how many wives did he have when he married Bathsheba? Yeah, he had 7, but the idea of marrying Bathsheba, you know what a mess that was? He saw her, he lusted after her, he took her, and then got her pregnant and said, man, we got to cover this up. We're going to get her wife or her husband in here, Uriah, so he can sleep with her and he'll think this is his baby. How sordid is that? And then when that doesn't work because Uriah's got too much character to go into his wife when his comrades are out in the field, he says, we're just going to have to kill him. What? Yeah. So they kill him, and then they stay together. Bathsheba and David, they stay married. Now that was never God's intent. When you read Matthew 19, Jesus says, from the beginning, this divorce stuff was not so. From the beginning, one man, one woman. but for their hardness of heart, he included that part of the law. So it was the men's hardness of heart against the women that divorce was even allowed at all. That wasn't God's intention. PJ.
read that in 2 Samuel 15, verse 60, it says, "So the king went out and all his household with him, but the king left 10 concubines to keep the house."
Oh, okay.
So he had at least 10.
All right. Had them concubines. And we'll talk about concubines some other time. But that was how many wives he had. So that wasn't God's intention either. But how many righteous men, how many just men, how many faithful men had multiple wives in the scriptures? How many wives did Abraham have? He had one, but who did he have Ishmael with? Hagar. Now, how would you like an arrangement like that today? No, that wouldn't fly in our culture because it's a completely different culture. It's an arrangement. That's not the way we do things. How about polygamy? Only if you're a Mormon. And the Mormons don't even do that anymore. That was something that was done in ages past, but it was never really God's plan. So in our culture today, it's just a sadness. And you would think that in Oklahoma, we would be one of the lowest rates of divorce, but actually we're one of the highest right here in Oklahoma. I've not yet figured that out. But to answer your question, I can only say what Jesus addresses. He addresses the faithfulness to the covenant. So for me to say, oh yeah, if there's abuse in the marriage, you can get a divorce. I'm not at liberty to say that. Now, can you leave? Can you get out of the home? Can you protect yourself? Absolutely. Absolutely. Otherwise, I'm not at liberty to say. All right. Things like that. Wouldn't you hate to be part of a justice system, a court system in the church that has to judge everybody's marriage? Oh, man. Yeah, really.
I will say this, Paul talked about how husbands should treat their wives and think of their wives and be around their wives and vice versa. And beating your wife is a long way away from our heart.
Well, the covenant is sacred. And one of the things about weddings, what do we have? What does every wedding have in our culture? We have vows. You're not going to go to a wedding ceremony and not have vows. Why do we have vows? Because we're not naturally going to do the right thing. Where else do you make a commitment and you have to make vows for that commitment? Only in marriage. Now we think about marriage as, oh, how romantic, how lovely, oh, we're going to have pink flowers and this. But you also have vows because that tells us that the nature of our humanity is that we're not going to do the right thing voluntarily. At some point, we're going to have somebody say, you made a vow. Oh, yeah, you're right. What's that?
Anything involving a contract.
Right.
Same thing. Everybody agrees what everybody's going to do.
And what are the vows that we normally make? Right. And you're giving an oath that puts your life on the line. That's what you do in a wedding ceremony. And I don't mean that in a bad way at all. That's an absolutely serious thing. When you say yes to another person to be married to them, you're putting your life on the line for them. You're giving up every other woman, giving up every other man, you're theirs. That's a sacred covenant. And to break that covenant, either by abuse or unfaithfulness, that's the last thing God wants. What's the imagery that Paul uses of Christ in the church in Ephesians? It's the marriage. The marriage.
They use the vow to get married. It doesn't mean anything to them. We say our vows, we're married.
It's just part of the tradition.
Yeah.
Just like throwing rice or anything else. And it's good. I'm in a place where I can talk to kids about those vows, although it's not always kids that get into marriage. But I can talk to them and say, what are your vows? You're making vows to each other. You're making promises to each other. And if you know somebody getting married and you love them, that's a good thing to remind them of. You're going to take vows. Take those vows seriously. If it's just a tradition, if you're just doing it to go through the motions, then don't even do it. Do it seriously. If you're going to make a vow, make a vow. What's that? When Jesus is talking about vows here, what's he saying? Here in the 5th chapter, verse 33, you've heard that the ancients were told, you shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord. But I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it's the throne of God, or by earth, for it's the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king. Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. But let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything beyond these is of evil. What's he saying?
Make an oath to love, honor, cherish, and obey, respect, submit. That's what you need to do. It's a life, a way of life. It's not just going to be a good day going tomorrow. It's a way of life.
I believe the character of our lives, well, Bob, go ahead.
I think what he's saying is that, you know, stuff's gonna happen, and you have no control. And so, before you vow, you need to remember that life is not, you're not gonna be able to, you know, to maintain that vow. So, don't even go there. Just say, yes, I'm going to do my best to do that, or no, I'm going to do my best not to do that. And, you know, move on down the road.
What's the issue we have with politicians? Besides the fact that they lie. Yeah, okay, really. They make promises, and you say, well, he's making promises he can't keep. And I know one of the things we hear sometimes during an election year is, no new taxes. I promise no new taxes. Well, how can you make that promise? You don't know what situation's going to come up where, okay, we might really need to talk about some taxes, maybe not the same kind of taxes that you're going to see on your 1040, but maybe a different kind of tax. I'm just saying life is so crazy that leave room for the Lord. Frank and then Bud.
They don't aim to keep them.
Yeah, even when they make them, they don't aim to keep
You can
them.
look at their face while they're making the speech about it and tell him that they don't aim to do that.
Yeah, how do you know if a politician's lying? His lips are moving. Isn't that a horrible thing? That's just it's a truism, though. We see it as that, but
When a group or a large bunch of people all come together for them to live in harmony, they have to have agreements with one another to do certain things. And that's what we do. That's why we elect our representatives, because all of us can't come up there and vote on something. We trust him to do his job. But the society in which we live functions by being honest to a degree. You know what I'm saying?
Sure.
There has to be a great deal of honesty involved in our society living together in peace. And that's why we have policemen. We have policemen to enforce that. We have governments to guide us in that. And so, when you tell people that they need, when they're going to get married, I had one person in particular who
Right.
If you refuse to consent in that manner, I said, you will not be married. You will not be a very nice person in our society.
And we understand that in so many different ways. If you're watching a football game on TV, half of us spend our time hollering at the referees. Well, what are the referees doing? They're trying to enforce the laws of football. Everybody agrees we're going to go by the laws of football. It's not going to be okay to be offsides this play, and you can be offsides the next play. That's all right. You've done it for 3 times, so you can do it the 4th. There are rules. You got rules in society, and God's got rules. And why do we have rules? When Paul wrote to Timothy, he said the reason we've got laws is because there are people who don't do the right thing by nature. Why else have laws? See, that's one of the great things to me about being around Christians. Christians, if they're really Christians, they do the right thing by nature. I was listening to a guy talk to an atheist, and the atheist was talking about the fact that Christianity has done more harm. Religious people have done more harm in the world. And he said, well, let me ask you a question. Say you're out at night and you're in a neighborhood you're not familiar with, and you break down and you're stranded. You don't have your phone, and you can't get help, and there's 4 great big guys coming at you down the street. What would happen in your thinking if you found out that those 4 guys had just come out of a Bible study? It's like, oh, okay. And I've told people that. They say, oh, you're stupid for believing in God. I say, you're stupid for trying to convince me not to, because if I started believing that there was no God, you would need to be afraid of me. You don't have to be afraid of me now, because I believe in God. And the fact that there is a God, that I believe in God, has changed me. And I'm not the person I would be if I did not have faith and trust in the fact that there was a God who's going to call me into account for my behavior. But since there is, I've changed myself. I've changed myself as best I can to conform to His way. And His way is that even if you're my enemy, I am compelled by Him to love you and to do the best thing for you, even if it means sacrifice on my part. You want me to go a mile? What do I have to do? I've got to go 2. And I better do it with a smile on my face, because I'm serving my Lord. You steal something from me, what am I obligated to do? Well, this sermon right here obligates me to give you even more than what you've already taken. What if you slap me on the cheek? Well, I'm obligated to turn the other cheek. That's a radical way to think. It's a radical way to live. And Jesus is teaching people that because He knows our human nature is not the way it should be. Why do we shouldn't ever have to consider about some guy beating his wife or abusing his wife, even verbally or emotionally. But it happens. Why? Because we're human beings and we're jerks sometimes. And no matter how many laws you make, it's like they're oh, we got to make more gun laws. Really? I think whoever shot people with guns has already broken a law or 2. Why? Because they are lawless. They are lawless. Law will protect us to some degree, but at the bottom line is everybody has to be willing to abide by the law, the code, whatever that code is. And Jesus is giving us a code that's not from this world. When Jesus was before Pilate, we'll read about it later. Pilate says, "Are you a king?" He says, "You betcha, but not of this world." And this teaching has not come from this world. This is not the way to live in this world as if this was the only world there is. This is the way to live in this world because there's another one, a better one, a higher one. And this is the way to suit ourselves to that kingdom. And if we die serving the Lord, now if you're a Muslim, what do you get?
Thinking along these lines, it's good to remember, thought in 2 Timothy 1:7, God gave you not the spirit of fearfulness, but of power.
Absolutely.
And love and discipline or self-control. And it does not mean because you turn the other cheek that you are weak, a lack of courage, or you lost your power. Romans 12:20 and 21, be not overcome with evil, but overcome evil. So we're not powerless by what Jesus gave us, but we are fearful.
Absolutely. And is vengeance a bad thing? What do you say about vengeance?
Vengeance is mine, thus saith the Lord.
He said, don't you take vengeance on yourself. Vengeance belongs to me, God says. And who do you think could do a better job of wreaking vengeance in somebody's life? So there it is. If I've got enough faith to say to the Lord, Father, you see the situation. You do what you think is right here. And he says, don't you worry about it. He's going down. He's going down hard. That's what the Revelation is all about. The Revelation is all about Rome persecuting God's people and God coming in judgment on Rome, and she goes down the tubes in a horrific way. And Jesus is calling the birds of the air, come to the supper of the Lord. I thought about this. We eat the Lord's Supper every week. But when you read about the supper of the Lord in Revelation, it's the flesh of the enemies of God being eaten by the birds. There's two kinds of suppers of the Lord, and both of them mean victory for us. Yes?
Jesus on the cross was not a sign of weakness, but a fantastic, lasting power.
Absolutely. That was justice on the cross. When you look at the cross, you see the love of God, but you also see the justice of God in his horrific judgment of sin. Jesus was the one willing to take that horrific judgment on himself. So thank God, literally, you and I don't have to suffer that kind of judgment. But that's what's coming. That death, that horrific, humiliating, criminal death is coming for all those who are outside of Christ. And God says, I don't want you to have to go through that, so my son's going to do that for you by his own accord. And we say, thank you, Lord. But you need to understand that's what's coming for everybody who's not that way. And that's not to say that you could wish that on your enemies. Because if you love your enemies, what are you going to do? You're going to try to convince them of the truth of the gospel, in spite of anything they do or say about you or to you. This is revolutionary. But it's not really revolutionary. It's only revolutionary in here. It's not revolutionary in heaven. This is the way it's always been in heaven. And that's where we're going. And he's trying to get us prepared for that in mind and heart. Bob, I think there might have been some other hands.
We can't really realize what it was like back in those days. They had so many wars and so many men were killed. There must have been a lot of widows and single women glad to be a third wife.
Right. There was a lot of different circumstances.
It was a lot of their way to live.
Well, it was a different day. You're right, Bill.
About the vengeance of the Lord and all that, take time to go back and read about the sojourn of Israel after the spies. And read about Korah and all those people again. And every time the Lord's going to wipe the whole congregation of Israel out, Moses and Aaron are on their face praying for them. And it's just, it's enlightening the fact that, it just seems like, every third verse, the Lord's about to wipe Israel off the face of the earth, it's just, that's kind of, interesting.
And they still don't change.
Yeah, they still don't change it.
And you come to Judges, and it's even worse in Judges. The reason there were so many judges was every judge indicated or signified a time when Israel fell from the grace of God, and he had to send a judge to bring them back up. They would sin. He would send punishment. They would repent. They'd cry out to God. He'd send them a judge. He'd rescue them, bring them back to a relationship with God. They would get comfortable with that and go back into sin. And then, well, it's just a continuing cycle in the Judges. Some of the judges, well. Absolutely. Absolutely. But I will point out, while that's true, we have not been commissioned by Christ to change the world. Don't take that burden on yourself. What have we been commissioned to do? Preach the gospel to every creature. It's on them to change. We'll try to convince them. We'll try to give them the truth, but it's on them to change. And if you preach to somebody and they don't change, you might spend years talking to them and they never change. That's not your fault. What have I done wrong? What have I done wrong? No. It's their responsibility to accept God just as much as it's your responsibility to accept God. And in our culture these days, when somebody does something wrong, there's all these people that rise, oh, what did we do wrong? It's society's fault. No, it's that goober's fault. He did it. He knew better. Put him in jail. Yeah, take him out to the river and cut his head off. If he murdered somebody or did the things that the Old Testament said you're supposed to be killed for. I believe in capital punishment. I think Romans 13 is God saying, I've given you governments to bear the sword so they won't bear it in vain. Why are they supposed to bear the sword? So that the bad guys live in fear. And that's what's wrong in the world today. Too many bad guys aren't afraid. That's why Putin doesn't like Trump. Because Trump, he'll push the button. He's crazy, that guy. The second bell's rung. I think we had some hands, Johnny and then Bud.
I was going to go back to the original reading there in Matthew. I said to you, verse 32, but I say to you that whoever divorces his wife, except on grounds of sexual immorality, causes her to commit adultery.
What's the assumption?
The assumption is
She's going to have to go out and get married.
another man.
Yeah.
Now, I'm assuming the male side of that is probably true too. I think God knew, because of the weakness of our flesh, that most of us would remarry.
And what has he ever given us that we haven't messed up?
But and the point is, that's not what God wants.
Right.
I mean, I think there's an Old Testament verse that says he hates divorce.
Yes, it's Malachi.
That's not what he wants.
Right.
Does he hate everybody that has divorce?
Don't think so.
I don't think so.
No. He hates lying too. How many of us have lied? It's
So, I mean, I would never condemn somebody. Yes, it is biblical to teach that, what Jesus said, of course. But that's a different step than being the one that's going to, you are going to hell because you remarried. And that's a totally different thing.
right. But, and I know the second bell's rung. If you need to go,
Just one closing thought. Our society operates on the principle of do all things in a fair and equitable manner. That's not as good as Christian is, but if we're going to make a decision, we ask if you deal fairly and if you deal equitably with another individual. If you have, then you broke the law.
well, that's a pretty good parting thought. Thank you all. Appreciate the attention and your involvement.